Now we're on the top of Daf Gimel Amid Beis, Hatenach L'Rabbanon on line 3. So let's just quickly review what we saw in Amid Aleph, and that is in the name of Rav that even though if he had in mind the Kohen at the time of the Avoda on, let's say, an Ola, and he had in mind L'Shem Shlomim, it's possible, but if he had in mind L'Shem Chulin, it's kosher because we apply the principle of min b'she'eno mino lo machriv ba. And the Gemara now asks a kasha on Rav from a case of tumas klicheres, where you have a drasha regarding tochan. If you have another kli inside the tanur, inside the klicheres, and whether or not the walls of that inner kli are chotzeitz to prevent the tumah, that if there's a sheretz inside the avir of the kli cheres, of the tanur, it would not penetrate inside the kli that's inside the larger kli, the inner kli, because the inner kli has defanos, and those are mechitzos, which will prevent, and that's called machriv ba, will prevent the tumah from spreading and penetrating inside the kli. And that's the Shita of the Rabbanon. And the Gemara establishes that according to the Shita of the Rabbanon, the mechitza of the defanos that's separating the oven, or again, the larger klicheres from the tochan, that's called lav mina, because the mechitza is lav mina. It's a whole different entity. It's made up of a different substance, and therefore we apply the principle of lo machriv ba, like the case of shchitas zevach l'shem chulin, where chulin is considered lav mina, and therefore lo machriv ba. And here lo machriv ba means that the tumah continues and is not stopped, and it enters into the tochan. So the Gemara says now, ha tenach l'Rabbanon. That makes sense according to the Rabbanon, but Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with Rabbanon, and he holds that the mechitza and the dafanos of the kli are going to prevent the spread of the tumah from outside the kli, meaning in the avir of the tanur, to penetrate inside the kli. So apparently Rabbi Eliezer is holding that even though it's min b'she'eno mino, nevertheless it's machriv ba. So the Gemara says that's not a kasha. Rabbi Eliezer kavachomer kama. Rabbi Eliezer, as we saw yesterday, derives his conclusion about the mechitza chotzetzes that will prevent the spread of the tumah from a kavachomer, from mess, from oil mess. That if you put up a mechitza inside an oil and the corpse is on one side of the mechitza, then kalim and human beings that are on the other side of the mechitza remain tahar. They are not contaminated. And that's a special kal vachomer. So it could be in general, as a rule of thumb, Rabbi Eliezer would agree to the Chachamim that min b'she'eno mino is lo machriv ba, and we would have spread the tumah like the Rabbanan hold from the avir of the kli cheres into the kli that's tochan, but we can't do so because we're bound by the kal vachomer. So the Gemara asks, "Ihachi hasam nami lema kal vachomer." Well, when we get to Rav's din with regard to a machshava l'shem chulin, which Rav claims is kosher, why don't we say the following kal vachomer? If kodshim mechalim kodshim, so for example, you had a carbon ola and you had in mind l'shem shlomim, and that's within the realm of kodshim, and yet it's machriv ba, meaning it passes the carbon, then chulin lo kolshkein. How much more so if you exit outside the entire realm of kodshim into the realm of chulin, which is a totally different world, then certainly a machshava l'shem chulin, which is even worse than from one shem zevach to another shem zevach, which is certainly possible the carbon. Ella, so at this point the Gemara says that if we want to reconcile Rav, who holds that l'shem chatos is kosher, with the shita of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the mechitza will prevent the spread of tumah inside the kli that's inside the larger kli, we're going to have to give another alternative explanation of Rabbi Eliezer in order to reconcile Rabbi Eliezer with Rav. Elatayim Rabbi Eliezer, the Omar Rabbi Elazar, based on a statement of Rabbi Elazar. So let's not get confused. Rabbi Eliezer is a Tana, and now the Gemara is quoting a statement of an Amora by the name of Rabbi Elazar. The Omar Rabbi Elazar, my time of the Rav, Rabbi Elazar is going to reveal to us a different underlying reason for the statement of Rav that if the Kohen shechted the carbon l'shem chulin, it's kosher, and that's based on a pasuk in Vayikra Chav Beis. It says, "V'lo yechalu es kodshei b'nei Yisrael eis asher yarimu l'Hashem." And now we have a very sophisticated drasha from this pasuk. Kodshim mechalim kodshim v'ein chulin mechalim kodshim. A machshavas chulin does not passel a carbon chat. So kodshim, let's say for example, if he shechted, the Kohen shechted a carbon chatas l'shem and other zevach, it's passel, but l'shem chulin it doesn't passel. So he explains here in the footnote the way this drasha works. Nothing could be machal kodshei b'nei Yisrael. It says lo yechalu es kodshei b'nei Yisrael. So we start with premise number one, that there's nothing that could desecrate that which is sanctified, and therefore we derive the conclusion that a machshavas chulin would not passel. If you're going to say that, then a machshavas kodshim for a different zevach should also not passel. But the answer is that the Gemara is going to derive that halacha, that a machshava from one zevach to another zevach passes the carbon from a special drasha. In Vayikra Dalet it says v'shachat oso lechatos, meaning that the shechita has to be l'shem chatos. So this is how we reconcile the two. On the one hand, the Torah says v'lo yechalu es kodshei b'nei Yisrael. On the other hand, the Torah passes a shinui kodesh from the pasuk v'shachat oso lechatos. So how do we reconcile this? So we're going to say that the first pasuk lo yechal l'shem es kodshim b'nei Yisrael, that you cannot be mechal the kodshim. That's because he had a machshava l'shem chulin, which is the opposite of kodshim. The pasuk tells me v'shachat oso lechatos, that you have to shecht it l'shem chatos, and here he shechted it l'shem chulin. The answer is that when it says that if you shecht it shalol l'shem chatos is possible, that's when you have in mind another zevach like shlomim or olam. The Gemara says the following: Alma, based on this statement of the Amora Rabbi Elazar, that lo yechalu teaches me that a machsheves l'shem chulin does not passel, even though logically we would have applied the kal v'chomer from machshava l'shem kodshim. Alma also krav afuki mikal v'chomer. You apparently we're applying a methodology that, although you can have a logical kal v'chomer, but a drush of a pasuk is more powerful and undermines a kal v'chomer. Is therefore, the Gemara asks the following kasha: Hochanami, even with regard to the mechitza of the tefanos inside the oven, where we had a kal v'chomer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that based on tumas mes, that the mechitza is chotzetzes, is leisei tocho and lafke mikal v'chomer. Why don't we dash in the pasuk tocho? And the drush of tocho is tocho v'lo tocho, and that's going to undermine the kal v'chomer. which means that even though the Kal V'chomer would tell me that there is chatzitza and that the mechitza is matzeles min atuma and it stops the tumah from spreading, but the drasha of tocho v'lo tocho indicates that only a kli that's inside the tanur, right, a dafka, a kli shebetocha tanur, can protect the ochlin inside of it. And that means a kli, but not a mechitza. Mechitza is not a kli, it's a wall. And therefore, tocho means a kli inside a kli, but not a mechitza inside a kli. So the Gemara answers that Rabbi Eliezer the Tana needs the pasuk tocho to derive a different halacha. Hi tocho mi boile li ochlin givlan betit. What happens if you take ochel and you completely hermetically seal it inside concrete so that you cannot touch the ochel because it's completely blocked off by the concrete that surrounds it? Now you have a sheretz inside the airspace of a kli cheres, a tanur, and you have ochlin that are giblan betit, and there's no maga. So now the question comes up: what's the relationship between tumas avir and tumas maga? And logically, we would have said that whole b'negia lo matami b'avir nami lo matami. We would have started with an equation between avir and maga. And since there's no possibility of a tumas maga in this case, because the ochel is completely sealed, hermetically sealed, therefore there's no possibility of a tumas avir. Kamash malon, that's what the pasuk of Tochan is coming to teach us. That despite the fact that there's no possibility of a tumas maga, nevertheless, the tumah of avir will apply because we're excluding the possibility of a mechitza. So therefore, we could always go back and say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, he would accept this Kal V'chomer. Rabbanon. So now the Gemara asks, according to your answer, in explaining the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, that the mechitza in the tanur is a chotzetzet, it's matzila b'fnei atuma, where the Chachamim hold that a mechitza is not matzelos b'fnei atuma. So Rabbanon hanach lo tzrichi krot. The Rabbanon hold that we don't need a pasuk to come and tell me that ochlan shegivlan betit, and they were inside the tanur. I don't need a pasuk to teach me that they become tamei. The Rabbanan hold pshita. The Rabbanan hold that's a simple assumption. The fact that these ochlan are not subject to be mitame b'negia because there's no possibility of negia, that would not lead me to any mistaken conclusion that they wouldn't be tamei in the avir of a kli cheres, because there's no equation between negia and avir. So therefore, according to Chachamim, that this din is pashut, then the pasuk of Tochan v'lo Tochan is not coming to teach me that halacha, which is pashut, but rather it's coming to teach me the halacha that a mechitza is not matzeles, only a kli b'tocha kli, but not a mechitza, and it's coming to exclude that Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Eliezer. Now we have another kasha, another apparent contradiction based on this principle that lav mina lo machriv bar Rabbi Yossi bar Ami. He's going to ask a question, present the contradiction, and then resolve it. Rami, he found a stira. Normally in the Gemara it says reminu, but here it says Rami. Shinui kodesh ashinui bailim. I find, says Rav Yosef Bar Ami, a contradiction between two categories of avoda haposelas. Number one, shinui kodesh, right? We had shalol lishma, and shinui bailim, where he had in mind for someone other than the owner of the carbon umashani, and Rav Yosef is going to resolve this contradiction. So what is Rav Yosef's kasha? Mi Amar Rav, chatos sheshchata l'shem chatos kshera. I'm sorry, 1 second. Yeah. If let's say a person brings a korban chatos because he ate chelev, and the Kohen ha'oved, when he shechted the korban chatos, he had in mind l'shem avon, l'shem chet of achilas dam, a different avera. Kshera. Rav says that in such a case, it's not considered shalol l'shma, because at the end of the day, it's l'shem chatos. Okay, it's not l'shem that chet, but it's certainly l'shem chatos, but l'shem ola psula. Alma, what do you see from this? The lav mina machriva, the mina lo machriva. Here we come to the exact opposite conclusion of what we've been assuming until now. Now we're saying dafka because he had in mind l'shem ola, which is not mina of a chatas, therefore the korban is possible. Until now we've been assuming that if it's lav mina, it's neutral, it comes from another world, like the case of a get that was written for an avodas kalchavim. We had the mindset that lav mina lo machriva. Now the Gemara is saying dafka the opposite. Because it's lav mina, that makes it a more radical, profound change, and therefore it's machriva. So he went from a chatas to an ola. If he's within the realm of mina, and meaning from one chatas to the other, then it's kshera. And now Rav Yosef bar Rab Ami asks the following steer. Rav, we have another statement of Rav himself that chatas sheshchata al misha mechuyev chatas psula. Al misha mechuyev ola kshera. So you have now a case of shinui bailim. Until now, we've been talking about shinui kodesh. Now there's another statement of Rav with regard to shinui bailim. And instead of shechting the chatas for the purpose of Ruvain, who's bringing the korban, he shechts it for Shimon. And Shimon is also chayav a chatas. And therefore it's mina, because it's all a min chatas. So even though there was a shinui bailim, but it's a shinui bailim of mina as far as the shem zevach is concerned, and the machayev of chatas for an avera. So both Reuven and Shimon had violated each one independently an avera sheish bo karis b'shogeg. Each one is chayev of chatas. And the Kohen, when he brought the korban of Reuven, he had in mind Shimon. And the halacha is that psula. And why is it psula? Because mina machriv ba. We just finished saying that according to Rav, in the case of a chatas sheshachta l'shem chatas, since it's mina, it's lo machriv ba. Now we're saying that since it was from one gavra who's chayav chatas to another, and it's mina, therefore it's psula. Misha mechuyev ola kshera. If he goes out of the realm of mina into a realm of ena mina, which means that instead of shechting it for Shimon, who's chayav chatos, he shechted it l'shem ola. I'm sorry. Instead of Shimon being chayav chatos, Shimon was chayav l'shem ola, and instead of the korban being brought with the mindset of Ruvain, it was brought with the mindset of Shimon. Ruvain is chayav chatos, Shimon is chayav an ola, which, by the way, means a korban adava, but that's not relevant to us now. Alma, the bar mina machriv ba, the lav bar mina lo machriv ba. On the contrary, what we're saying is that if it's all within the realm of chatos, meaning the shinui bailim was from Reuven to Shimon, both of whom share the common chiyuv chatos, then we're saying that it's machriv ba. It is psula. And until now, we were saying that if it's min b'mina, according to Rav, meaning it's not ena mina, but rather it was two chiyuvei chatos, one for achilas chelev, the other for achilas dam, then Rav said it's kshera. Well, why not apply the principle here of min b'mina machriv ba, umeshadi? And the same Rav Yosef, who raised this contradiction, resolved it, Hassam, in the case of Shinui Kodesh, where we said that if he has in mind a different chait, is then we're going to dash in the pasuk v'shachat osol lechatos omar achmona. Your shchita has to be for the purpose of a chatos. It doesn't say it has to be for the chatos of achilas chelev. Achilas dam is also a shchita l'shem chatos. V'arei chatos l'shem chatos nishchita. But hacha, here, in the case of shinui shem bailim, the keeper olav meaning on behalf of this fellow, ksiv, it says in the pasuk, olav v'lo al chavero. Now, what are we darshan about olav v'lo al chavero? You brought it for him, the bailim of the korban, but not for somebody else. Chavero dum yudideh. It's got to be chavero that's similar to the vala korban, which means, what's the similarity between Reuven and Shimon? Shemachuyev kapara kimoso, that he also, Shimon, is chayiv in a korban chatas. And therefore we passel olav v'lo al chavero shedum yud liolav. So dafka, because it's min b'mino, therefore it's machriv, because it's going to be olav dumya de chavero. Aber, if he's not mechuyev a korban chatas, Shimon is only chayiv a korban ola, then the machshava for the purpose of Shimon doesn't passel the korban. And truthfully speaking, this is counterintuitive. If not for the drush of the pasuk, it makes no sense, because if Ruvain violated a chet and he has to bring a chatos, and when he brought the chatos, the Kohen had in mind l'shem Shimon, we got tarti l'reisa, the two negatives here, because first of all, the Kohen had in mind a different bailim, namely Shimon, and secondly, Shimon is not even chayiv a chatos at all. So you would have said in that case, for sure, it would be kosher. I'm sorry, for sure it would be possible, and yet it's kosher. Why? Because it's not dumya, it's not what you call, what's the language of the Gemara? Chavera dumya dideh. Now, Rav Chamima Ravi, we have another stira between Shinui Bailim and Tocho. Umeshani, and then Rav Chaviva is going to reconcile. Umi Amar Rav Chatos Shechata Mishim Chayiv Chatos Psula. If, in a case of Shinui Bailim, Rav says that Shimon, like Reuven, is Chayiv Chatos, and therefore the Shinui Bailim is passes it. But Al Mishim Mechuyev Ola, if Shimon is not Chayiv Chatos, but rather he's Chayiv an Ola, then it's kshera, it's min b'sheino mino eno machriv ba, alma mino machriv ba, la mino lo machriv ba vatanya. What are we going to do with a brisa that we quoted already on Daf Gimel with regard to Tumas Shemeretz in an aver kli cheres? And we said tocho v'lo tocho v'afilu kli shetef matzil. So what's the inner kli that prevents the tumah from spreading from outside the inner kli, namely a sheretz inside the avir of the kli cheres? It's going to be afilu kli shetef. Kli shetef, as we said yesterday, is made of wood or made of metal, and it's not at all similar to earthenware, and therefore it's eno mino. And now we're going to say that lav mino machriv ba. Let's see if we figure this out. Afilu kli cheres matzil. Matzil means machriv ba, means it doesn't allow the tumah to spread. And because it's tocho, it's a kli within a kli, and the definers of that kli, of the inner kli, are going to protect the what we call machriba, contain the tuma in the avir of the kli cheres outside of the inner kli. And now, in the case of kli shetef, which is, as we said before, made of a totally different material than the tanur, than the kli cheres, and therefore it's called lav mina, and yet it's matzil, it is machriba, and it quelches, if you could use that word, the tuma of the avir of the tanur. So on the one hand, we're saying here that according to the brisa, or actually, yeah, it's a brisa. In the case of tuma, we apply the principle of lav mina machriba. Again, machriba means it contains and restricts the tuma, even though it's lav mina. And yet, Rav says that dafka in a case where the machsheves shinui bailim from Reuven to Shimon was a case where Shimon is if he's chayav achatos, then it's machriv ba. Just 1 second. If he's chayav achatos, right? Because that's called mina. So mina is machriv, but if he's chayiv an ola, which is lav mina, Rav paskins kshera, because Rav is applying the principle of lav mina lo machriv, and we saw in the case of kli shetef that lav mina machriv, and it contains the tuma. Umeshani, and Rav Chaviva gives a reconciliation, and he says the following: Arba tocho ksivi. Now, in truth, Rabbosai, the word tocho appears twice. What does the Gemara mean when it says 4 times? It only appears twice. It says Asher Yipo Me'emel Tocho or Kol Asher B'Tocho, but in each case there's an extra vav at the end of the word. It could have said Toch, and it says Tocho, and the extra vav doubles the amount of times that it says in the pasuk, and therefore it's as if it said the word Toch 4 times. And what do we darshan from these 4 times? 4 drashos: Toch, Tocho, Tocho, and Tocho. Chad, one of them is legufo. Legufo means that Avir Kli Cheres is metame. So therefore, if you have Ochlin that entered into the airspace of a Kli Cheres, and there was a sheretz in that airspace, the Ochlin become Tomei because it's the airspace of a Kli Cheres. V'chad, and a second Tocho, L'gzeira Shava. Let's just stop for a minute and think about this Gzeira Shava. What? Let me say it out loud and then it'll sink in. Right? If you have a kli and you have ochlin inside the avir of the kli, then the ochlin contract tuma through tumas avir. And what is the Gzeira Shava now going to teach me? That if the sheretz is inside the avir of the kli, then it's metame the kli. So again, we have 2 halachas here. One is that because of the avir, we're going to say that the kli itself is tamei, and the ochlin inside the kli are tmeim. And now we're saying, again, let me just go over one more time. The Gzeira Shava is going to teach me that just like the avir of the tuma is metame the ochlin that are inside the avir, so you have both the sheretz and ochlin inside the airspace of the kli cheres, so too the sheretz inside the aver, the tumah, is going to be mitami the kli itself. So it's both the ochlin inside the kli and the kli itself. Chad, now we're up to the third tocho. Tocho shel zeh, velo tocho shel acher. Which means that if inside this kli cheres, you have a kli that's made of other materials like wood or metal, they do not become tomei in the avir of the kli cheres. Idoch, now we get to the fourth tocho. Tocho velo toch tocho, vafilu kli shetif matzil. In other words, we'd have applied the principle of kli shetif is a lav mino, and therefore lo machriv ba, and therefore the walls of a kli shetif, that's eitz or matex, would not protect and contain the tumah. Why wouldn't it protect the tumah? Because it's lav mino lo machriv ba, kamashmal, and therefore I have this drasha 4 times it says tocha. The fourth one is to teach me that in this particular case we're going to say that lav mino machriv ba, and it's matzeles.